When deputies pulled up to the abandoned sedan outside Gap, Pennsylvania, the engine was still running. The hazard lights were blinking like a heartbeat. The driver's door was wide open, and the only thing missing was the woman who owned it. But when the officers stepped toward the tree line to start searching, they heard something that didn't belong in the report. Slow footsteps circling them in the dark, keeping pace, stopping when they stopped, like someone was still out there watching. And the strangest part is this. The footprints they found led straight into the woods, and then suddenly ended, as if the ground itself decided to erase what happened next. Before we get into this case, I want you to listen closely. Because what happened outside Gap, Pennsylvania wasn't just another missing person story. Police documented details that still don't make sense, and the deeper you go, the more it feels like someone was out there that night. So if you're into real cases where true crime meets the unexplained, subscribe to our channel, and tell me at the end what you think was really walking in those woods. When police first arrived outside Gap, Pennsylvania, the car was still running. The hazard lights blinked in steady pulses, painting the trees in brief flashes of orange like a warning nobody could translate. The driver's door hung open into the night air, and the cabin light glowed over the empty seat like it was waiting for someone to come back and shut it off. Deputies noted it immediately. No broken glass, no skid marks, no obvious crash damage. Just an abandoned sedan pulled off where the road narrows, where the farmland fades into woods, and where the dark feels thicker than it should. The license plate came back to a local woman, 28 years old, no criminal history, no record of running away, no reason to vanish without leaving a trace. And yet the scene already felt wrong, like the road itself had paused to witness something it didn't want to explain. Dispatch logs later showed the first call came in at 2:07 a.m., placed by a passing driver who thought he saw someone standing near the trees. He couldn't describe the person clearly, only that the shape looked thin and still, like someone watching traffic instead of seeking help. By the time the deputies pulled up, the figure was gone. Their flashlights swept the brush, the ditch, the edges of the tree line, catching nothing but wet leaves and pale bark. The air smelled like damp soil and cold metal, and somewhere deeper in the woods, a branch snapped with a clean, dry crack. One deputy called out a name he didn't know yet, voice loud enough to sound confident, but not loud enough to hide the uncertainty underneath. There was no answer, only the wind moving through the gap between the hills, whispering in a way that felt almost deliberate. The woman was Marissa Lyle, that's what the registration said. A local raised nearby, the kind of person who knew these roads by instinct, who drove them late at night without thinking twice. Her purse was on the passenger seat, half open, cash still inside. Her wallet, too. That alone made the deputies exchange a look that lasted just a second longer than normal. People who walk away voluntarily don't leave their money behind. Her keys were still in the ignition. Her phone wasn't anywhere in sight. The deputy leaned into the car and saw something else. A faint smear on the inside of the driver's door, not enough to scream blood, but enough to tighten the throat. He didn't touch it. He just backed away, and the road suddenly felt less like a road and more like a boundary line between the normal world and whatever waited beyond the trees. It began with the obvious. Search the immediate area. Check the ditch line for a body, check the brush for signs of a fall, walk the shoulder with flashlights low, scanning for dropped items, a shoe, anything. Every few steps, the gravel crunched under their boots, loud in the silence. They called her name again and again, and each time it came back to them swallowed and thin. Then one of them found the first footprint. It was pressed into soft mud beside the brush, clean enough to see the tread pattern. A woman's shoe. Deep heel impression, a forward step, then another, and another. The prints moved away from the car in a straight line, leading toward the tree line like a decision already made. It didn't look like wandering. It didn't look like confusion. It looked like someone walking with purpose into a place where the light didn't want to go. The deputies followed slowly, careful not to destroy what they might need later, flashlights sweeping ahead like thin white knives. The woods here weren't dense in the way forests are in movies. They were worse, sparse enough that you could see shapes between the trunks, but crowded enough that every shadow had somewhere to hide. The ground dipped slightly, forming a natural corridor locals called the Gap, where the trees leaned inward and the air turned colder even in mild weather. The footprints led right into it. And then about 20 yards in, they stopped. Not faded, not scattered, just ended, like someone had stepped off the earth, like the ground had refused to hold the rest of the story. One deputy stood there, staring down at the last print, and without thinking he whispered, "Where did she go?" As if the woods might answer if spoken to gently. That's when they heard it. At first it was so faint they thought it was their own movement echoing back. A soft crunch of leaves behind them, then another. The deputies froze. The sound froze too. A few seconds passed, heavy and silent, and then one of the deputies shifted his weight slightly, just enough to make his boot scrape the ground. And the footsteps started again, slow and careful, circling to their right, always just outside the reach of the flashlight beam. The deputy swung the light in that direction, and the sound stopped instantly, like someone had learned the rules of being unseen. He held the beam there, breathing shallow, waiting. Nothing moved. No animal darted away. No human voice cursed at being caught. The darkness simply held its shape. When he lowered the light again to check the footprints, the steps resumed, closer now, deliberate, patient, like something following them in a way that didn't feel human at all. Protocols say you don't let your mind run ahead of evidence. But in that moment, evidence wasn't enough to anchor the fear. The deputies backed out toward the road, still scanning the trees, still calling out, now more sharply. Over the radio, one of them requested additional units and a K-9 team. He didn't mention the footsteps, not yet. It sounded ridiculous even in his head. But the silence between his words carried the tension anyway. When backup arrived, headlights washed the tree line in harsh white light, exposing branches and brush and nothing else. The footsteps didn't return with the extra people around. But the feeling remained, a heavy, watched sensation that didn't fade when the lights got brighter. Like whatever had been circling them wasn't afraid of being seen. It simply preferred not to be. By sunrise, the scene expanded. Yellow tape, evidence markers, photographs of the footprints taken from multiple angles. A search grid drawn on maps spread across a patrol car hood. Volunteers from local fire departments showed up, wearing reflective gear that looked too bright for a place this dark. A command post formed near the pull-off, radios buzzing, coffee steaming in paper cups, the strange normalcy of emergency work settling over something that wasn't normal at all. Marissa's family arrived just after 8:00 a.m. Her mother stepped out of the car holding a folded sweatshirt like she grabbed it without thinking, as though warmth could be delivered through cloth alone. A detective explained what they knew, which was almost nothing, and what they were doing, which was everything they could. But every time he spoke, his eyes drifted toward the tree line, toward the gap where the footprints ended, as if he couldn't stop picturing how easily a person could be erased out there. The K-9 handler walked his dog to the last known print. The dog sniffed, tail stiff, then began pulling forward fast, confident, trained to chase the invisible thread of humans sent through terrain that confused most people. It moved toward the gap, nose low, paws steady. Then it stopped so abruptly the handler nearly stumbled. The dog's ears lifted. Its body went rigid. A low whine escaped its throat, the kind of sound animals make when instinct overrides training. The handler tugged gently, encouraging it forward, but the dog refused, backing away a step, eyes locked on the dark corridor between the trees as if something stood there that the humans couldn't see. The handler looked up, unsettled, and murmured something under his breath that didn't make it into any report. Because how do you document the fact that the dog seemed afraid of the woods itself? Investigators began asking the questions that always come next. Who was she with? Was she arguing with someone? Did she stop for gas? Was she drinking? Did she make a call? They pulled phone records quickly, but without the device in hand, it was just numbers and timestamps. They checked nearby cameras, but this part of the road had no homes facing it, no businesses, no convenience stores with glowing signs and security footage. It was a blind spot, the kind of place where things happen and no one can swear they saw them. One deputy walked back toward the car and noticed something small near the driver's seat. A single hairpin on the floor mat, half covered in dirt. It might have been hers. It might have meant nothing. But it felt like the kind of object that falls when a head turns too fast, when a person is startled, when fear makes your hands forget what they're holding. That afternoon, searchers expanded outward, combing creek lines and low ravines, calling her name until their voices became rough. They found no clothing, no jewelry, no signs of a fight, just the woods, quiet and indifferent, swallowing sound as if it didn't want to share what it knew. Then around 4:00 p.m., a volunteer shouted that he'd found something. A phone. Face down near the base of a tree, screen cracked, lying too neatly to look accidental. It wasn't buried. It wasn't washed away. It sat there like an offering. The detective picked it up with gloved hands and turned it over, and in that moment the case felt like it shifted. Because if the phone was here, then Marissa had been here. And if Marissa had been here, then what exactly happened between the car and the last footprint that ended like a sentence cut off mid-word? They brought the phone back to the command post and tried the basics. No signal, low battery, no new messages. But when the tech later extracted the data, there was something buried in the files that made the room go quiet. A short accidental audio recording created in the early minutes after her last call, only 23 seconds long. Wind, faint breathing, and footsteps in the background, slow and steady, crunching leaves in a rhythm that sounded too close. Not rushing, not running, just approaching. Stopping, approaching again, like whoever, or whatever, was moving out there wasn't in a hurry. Like it had all the time in the world. And the most terrifying detail was the way the footsteps seemed to react to Marissa's movement, matching it like a shadow that didn't need light to follow. That night after the search teams went home, after the tape fluttered in the cold wind and the hazard lights were finally switched off, the gap was left alone again, just trees and darkness and the sound of nothing. But in the first responding deputy's report, written carefully in plain language, one phrase appeared that didn't belong beside words like terrain and weather conditions. It read, "Audible movement, unconfirmed source." No explanation, no speculation, just that. The kind of line you include when you're trying to be honest without being laughed at. And the question that settled over the case like fog was simple, unbearable, and impossible to ignore. If Marissa walked into those woods alone, then whose footsteps were recorded following her into the gap? If Marissa walked into those woods alone, then whose footsteps were recorded following her into the gap? That question didn't get spoken out loud at the command post, not in front of the family and not on an open radio channel, but it stayed in the spaces between everyone's words. It followed the detectives into their cars, into their paperwork, into the quiet drive home where the same stretch of road suddenly looked unfamiliar. The department treated it like a missing person investigation at first. Routine procedures, search patterns, a widening perimeter. But nothing about the evidence felt routine because the woods weren't giving them the kind of clues the woods usually give. No broken branches from a fall, no torn clothing, no dropped shoe, no desperate crawl marks in the mud. Just that trail of footprints that ended too cleanly, and that phone recording that sounded like someone was there with her, close enough to be heard breathing through the trees. The next morning, the gap filled again with motion and noise. Searchers returned with ropes, drones, thermal imaging, and K9 units that pulled hard at their leads until they reached the same point, and then hesitated like they'd hit an invisible wall. One handler tried to laugh it off, calling his dog stubborn, but his face didn't match the joke. The animals weren't confused. They were resisting. It wasn't that they couldn't track her scent, it was that they didn't want to. One deputy walked behind the teams with a notepad, documenting zone progress and times, but he kept glancing over his shoulder, feeling childish for it and doing it anyway. The gap was quiet in the daylight, almost ordinary, but every few minutes the wind moved through the trees with a sound like slow steps, and you couldn't tell if it was nature or something pretending to be nature just well enough to pass. Inside the sheriff's office, detectives began rebuilding Marissa's night piece by piece. Cell tower pings placed her phone near her duplex until 1:32 a.m., then moving along the main road that cut toward the edge of gap. At 1:41 a.m., she made a call to her sister that lasted 9 seconds. There was no voicemail, no text afterward. That call became the last confirmed moment that Marissa was alive and in control of her phone. Investigators contacted the sister first, sitting her down in a small interview room that smelled like old coffee and paperwork. The sister's hands shook as she described answering the call half asleep. She heard nothing at first, just faint wind. Then Marissa's voice, low and strained, saying only one word, "Wait," before the line went dead. The sister swore she heard something else in the background too, something like slow crunching steps, and the detective wrote it down even though he didn't know what to do with it. Because sometimes all you can do is collect pieces and hope one day they form a shape. They checked Marissa's recent messages and social media activity. No threats, no suspicious conversations, no meetups arranged in secret. The kind of clean digital life that should have meant safety but instead made her disappearance feel even more unnatural. A coworker from the diner where Marissa worked late shifts told police she'd been off lately, distracted, complaining of being tired even when she'd slept. When asked why, the coworker hesitated, then admitted Marissa had mentioned hearing footsteps near her home at night, slow steps on the porch, pacing sounds that stopped when she checked the peephole. The coworker had laughed it off at the time, told her it was raccoons or stray cats. But now she looked sick with regret because she remembered Marissa's face when she said it. Not dramatic, not playful, just quietly afraid, like she didn't want to give the fear too much power by describing it in detail. That detail pushed detectives to search Marissa's duplex more thoroughly. The place was small, neat, the kind of home where everything had a place because disorder felt stressful. There were dishes in the sink, but nothing rot. Her bed was unmade, but not in a way that suggested a struggle, more like someone had slept badly and gotten up quickly. In the living room, a small camera was mounted facing the front porch, a cheap home security setup she'd installed herself, except the camera was dark. Unplugged, the cord wasn't cut or damaged, just removed from the outlet and tucked behind a plant pot as if someone had taken the time to hide the fact that it was off. A technician dusted the plug and found no readable prints. Not Marissa's, not anyone's. That meant it had been wiped clean, and wiping is not something accidents do. Wiping is a choice, a careful one. The detective stared at that outlet longer than he should have, thinking about how close someone would need to be to enter her space and disable her only line of protection without leaving anything behind. The more they looked, the more the case slipped between categories. A missing adult could be voluntary, but the running car and purse said no. An abduction would leave signs, but the scene was too clean. A mental health crisis could explain walking into the woods, but toxicology later would show no substances that might trigger confusion, and her family insisted she'd been stable, grounded, not the type to wander off into darkness for no reason. Another investigator pulled Marissa's driving history, looking for previous accidents, prior roadside calls, anything that suggested she might stop her car and step out impulsively. There was nothing. She was cautious, predictable. The kind of person who took the same routes, parked in the same spot at work, locked her doors twice. And yet on this night, she left her car door open like she forgot fear existed for a moment, which meant something had made her move fast. Near the end of day 2, the search team leader requested permission to bring in a state police unit with better aerial equipment. Drones flew above the tree canopy, their cameras picking up heat signatures of deer and small animals moving through brush. Nothing human. No body curled under leaves. No bright flare of warmth indicating someone still alive. Searchers went deeper anyway, pushing through thickets and down into creek beds, their boots sinking into wet ground. A few of them reported hearing footsteps behind them the same way the first deputies had. It became a pattern. When teams walked, a faint crunch followed. When they stopped, the sound stopped. When they turned their lights toward it, there was nothing. Some refused to talk about it afterward because they didn't want to be mocked. Others documented it quietly, describing it as possible wildlife movement. But everyone knew wildlife didn't behave like that. Animals don't mirror you. Animals don't circle like they're curious about your fear. On the third day, the weather turned colder. A thin mist clung to the low ground, and the gap looked like it was breathing. Investigators returned to the roadside again, photographing, measuring, trying to find anything they missed the first time. That's when a trooper noticed something subtle. The driver's door in 2 early scene photographs didn't match. In the first image, taken as deputies arrived, it was wide open. In the second, taken minutes later, it appeared slightly more closed, not fully shut, but closer than before. Wind could move a door, but not gently and not with that kind of stop. A door swings. It doesn't hesitate. That small difference sat like a thorn in the evidence. Someone could have touched it. Someone could have returned to the car after Marissa left it. Someone could have been watching the police arrive and then retreated back into the woods like smoke. They pulled dashcam footage from the first responding unit. The video itself looked like nothing at first. Headlights, trees, the sedan's flashing hazards. 2 deputies stepping out, flashlights raised, voices calm. But the audio was clearer than anyone expected. You could hear their boots on gravel, their breathing, a distant radio chirp. And underneath it all, faint but distinct, were footsteps that didn't belong to either deputy. They were softer, like wet leaves being crushed under something careful. They moved when the deputies moved. They paused when the deputies paused. It sounded less like someone running away and more like someone pacing them through the trees, matching them the way a hunter matches prey, staying just outside the light, never rushing because it didn't need to. A technician enhanced the sound, filtering wind and engine noise, and the steps only became more obvious, a steady rhythm that made the room go quiet in a way no one could fake. One deputy, watching the footage back, rubbed his face and said almost to himself, "That's what I heard." It wasn't triumph, it was dread, because hearing it again meant it wasn't imagination, it wasn't nerves, it wasn't the mind playing tricks. It was real sound captured on official equipment, which meant someone or something had been there on that road with them, close enough to be recorded and still invisible. In the final seconds of the dashcam clip, one deputy turns toward the gap and shines his flashlight deeper between the trunks. For half a second, the beam catches something pale at shoulder height, too tall to be a stump, too still to be an animal. It could have been fog. It could have been a branch reflecting light. But it had the outline of a person standing perfectly motionless, like it was waiting to see if the light would find it. The deputy freezes and you hear him whisper into his radio, "Did you see that?" Then nothing. No reply. Only the sound of his breath and the faint crunch of footsteps retreating deeper into the trees. After that footage surfaced internally, the case changed tone. It wasn't just a missing person anymore. It was a scene with a second presence, unidentified, unconfirmed, but repeatedly suggested by sound, by movement, by patterns too intelligent to dismiss. Detectives kept the footage tight, not released to the public, because panic spreads fast in small towns. But within the department, the questions started multiplying. If there was another person out there, why didn't they leave clearer tracks? Why didn't they speak? Why did the footsteps stop the moment a flashlight turned toward them, like they understood what light does, like they knew exactly how to remain a rumor instead of evidence? By late afternoon, they expanded the perimeter again, pushing toward the creek line behind the gap where the ground dropped and the forest became slick with mud. Teams moved slowly, stepping around puddles, scanning for anything unnatural. A volunteer found a hair tie caught on a branch, pale pink, matching the kind Marissa wore. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread. Another searcher found a shallow scuff in the dirt that looked like someone had slipped and caught themselves. Then near one of the deeper bends where the creek ran black under roots, a deputy found drag marks, not long, not clear, but just enough disturbance to suggest something heavy had been pulled or rolled. It ended near the water's edge. The deputy stood there staring at it, feeling the cold crawl up his spine because the creek didn't look dangerous. It looked small, ordinary, but something about that spot felt like a mouth. As dusk fell, the search paused. Floodlights were set up. Radios crackled. Marissa's mother refused to leave the command post, sitting in her car with the seat reclined, staring at the trees as if staring hard enough could force the truth out. The detective in charge told her they were doing everything possible, and she nodded like she understood, but her eyes were hollow with a kind of grief that begins even before confirmation arrives. In the quiet between shift changes, one deputy admitted to another that he didn't want to go back into the gap at night. He said it casually like a joke, but his hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. The other deputy didn't tease him. He just stared at the woods and said, "Me neither." Because both of them knew something that couldn't be written into a report. The gap didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. And if Marissa had walked into it alive, then whatever followed her in that recording might still be out there now, listening for the next set of footsteps to join it. It felt occupied. And if Marissa had walked into it alive, then whatever followed her in that recording might still be out there now, listening for the next set of footsteps to join it. The night search began anyway, because procedure doesn't stop for fear, and because families don't sleep while someone they love is missing. Floodlights turned the roadside pull-off into a harsh, artificial island of brightness, but the light couldn't reach far into the woods. Past a certain point, everything became blue-black again, tree trunks swallowing the beam like it was nothing. Deputies rotated in pairs, stepping into the gap with radios clipped close and flashlights held high, calling out Marissa's name in voices that sounded steadier than they felt. The ground was slick from daytime mist, and the leaves underfoot made every step loud, a constant reminder that anything out there could hear them coming long before they could see it. Just after midnight, one of the search teams reported a possible sighting near the creek sink. A volunteer claimed he saw a pale shape between trees, motionless at the edge of his flashlight beam. He thought it was a person at first, a figure facing away. When he called out, the shape didn't turn. It didn't run. It simply wasn't there a second later, as if it had stepped backward into darkness without making a sound. The volunteer's voice shook when he relayed it over the radio. The response from command was calm, professional, instructing them to hold position and wait for backup. But the silence after the call felt heavier than the words. In the logs later, the note would be reduced to something sterile, unconfirmed visual, no contact. But out in the trees, where fear became physical, nobody could pretend it was nothing. By morning of the sixth day, exhaustion had set in. Searchers moved slower. Voices became quieter. The woods looked unchanged, as if they had been searched 100 times already and still refused to give anything back. The command post was filled with discarded coffee cups, damp gloves, mud-caked boots lined in rows near vehicles. Detectives sat inside warm patrol cars staring at maps, tracing lines that led nowhere. That's when the call came in from a hunter on private land behind the gap. He'd been checking a trail camera and walking the creek line when he noticed something caught against a fallen log in shallow water. He said at first he thought it was a deer carcass. He said he didn't realize it was a person until he saw hair. And then he said something that made the dispatcher's voice drop. "It's a woman. I think she's dead." The kind of sentence that changes the temperature of every room it enters. The recovery was careful, methodical, quiet in the way death makes people quiet even when they've seen it before. Deputies sealed off the creek area and photographed everything before moving her. The body was face down, partially submerged, clothing dark and heavy with water. Her shoes were still on. That detail stood out immediately because shoes are usually the first thing lost in moving water, and these were still tied like she'd stepped into the creek deliberately or been placed there with care. A medic confirmed there was no pulse, no warmth, only the stiff reality of time passing. When the coroner's office arrived, they spoke in low voices, and nobody said Marissa's name until identification was confirmed, as if speaking it too early could make it more real. At the morgue, the autopsy answered some questions and opened worse ones. The official cause of death was listed as drowning, water in the lungs, no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no catastrophic injuries. On paper, it was the kind of conclusion that could close a case quickly, the kind that could be called a tragic accident in the woods at night. But the manner of death was ruled undetermined, which was a quiet confession that nothing about this felt clean. There were minor abrasions on her ankles and calves, small scratches consistent with moving through brush, tiny wood splinters embedded in the skin. Her hands showed no heavy defensive wounds, no broken nails, no bruising that screamed struggle. Yet her injuries told a story of movement, of being forced through terrain quickly enough to scrape and tear, like she wasn't calmly walking, like she was trying to get away from something she didn't want behind her. The creek itself became the next problem. Investigators returned to the exact location where she was found and measured the depth. In most places, it barely reached a knee. The sink, where her body had been caught, was deeper. Dark water pooled under roots where the creek bed dropped suddenly. But it wasn't deep enough to swallow a person easily unless they were disoriented, restrained, or exhausted beyond reason. That led to the simplest question with the hardest implications. How does a healthy adult drown in a creek that's shallow without a struggle, without claw marks in the mud, without obvious signs of violence? The coroner didn't offer theories. That wasn't his job. He documented what he saw and left investigators to carry the weight of what it might mean. Detectives searched again for physical evidence that would force the case in one direction. They checked her clothes for tears consistent with being grabbed. They collected fibers and soil samples. They photographed every scratch. They tested her for drugs and alcohol. Toxicology returned clean enough to remove easy explanations. No heavy intoxication, no sedatives, no drugs that would make her wander into freezing water without understanding the danger. That result should have been relief. Instead, it made everything worse. Because it meant Marissa's choices that night were likely made with a clear mind, which meant she either walked into that creek deliberately, or someone guided her there, or she was running from something she could hear but couldn't see. Her family's grief hardened into anger when they were told the manner of death was undetermined. Undetermined felt like abandonment, like paperwork replacing justice. Her mother demanded answers that nobody had. Her sister demanded to know why the porch camera had been unplugged, why the phone was found like it was placed, why the footprints ended. Detectives could only tell them the truth. There was no suspect, no clear cause, and no clear timeline. The department held a brief press conference, careful with language. They said the death was under investigation. They asked for tips. They described Marissa as beloved, known in the community, and deeply missed. But they avoided mentioning the audio recording. They avoided mentioning the dashcam footsteps. Because once the public hears a case contains something that sounds impossible, it stops being an investigation and becomes a myth, and myths attract people who don't care about the dead. Behind closed doors, the investigative team debated theories that ranged from human to unthinkable. Could someone have lured her out of the car? Could she have met someone there willingly, then panicked? Could there have been an accident followed by concealment? They reviewed phone records again and found one oddity. Her last call to her sister was placed from a spot near the gap, but the phone itself was later found farther inside the woods near the tree line. That meant it traveled after the call. Either Marissa carried it deeper or someone else did. And the accidental recording, those 23 seconds of footsteps, suggested she wasn't alone during that movement. The tech who listened to it more than once said the steps sounded too controlled, too slow for someone running. More like someone pacing, circling, letting her know they were there, letting the fear build. He said it sounded like a presence that wasn't trying to hide completely, just trying to remain unseen. The timeline became a knife edge. If Marissa left her home around 1:30 a.m., made the call at 1:41, and her car was found around 2:00, that left minutes, small, tight minutes where everything happened. Yet the estimated time of death window from the medical examiner didn't line up cleanly with those timestamps. Cold water and low temperatures made precision difficult, and investigators tried to rationalize the discrepancy as normal forensic uncertainty. But even small misalignments can matter. It raised a chilling possibility. that the phone's movement and the recorded footsteps might not belong neatly to the moment she died, that they might be the echo of something continuing after her last conscious actions, something still moving in those woods while the rest of the world believed the story was over. Then came the moment the case truly refused to behave like a normal drowning. A detective re-examining the phone data noticed that the accidental audio file wasn't the only strange artifact. There were 2 brief screen activations after the last call, both lasting less than a second, like the phone had been handled and the screen lit up accidentally. No unlock, no further calls. Just the screen waking in the dark twice at 1:49 and 1:53 a.m. That meant the phone was in motion during those times, touched, shifted, activated by pressure or contact. The detective stared at those timestamps for a long time because it meant someone carried that phone deeper into the woods for at least 12 minutes after Marissa's last contact with her sister. If Marissa was alive, why didn't she call again? If she was alive, then who was touching her phone? Investigators returned to the gap once more with a forensic mapping team. They scanned the area around the last footprints, around the tree where the phone was found, around the creek sink. They found partial impressions that didn't match Marissa's shoes, faint, inconsistent, as if a second set of prints had been made by someone stepping carefully, avoiding soft ground, trying not to leave a trail. They weren't clear enough to cast. They weren't clear enough to swear in court. But they were enough to haunt the detectives who saw them. Because if a person had been there, moving quietly, then the case was criminal. And if a person hadn't, then what exactly was making footsteps follow her through those woods and then vanish when the light turned toward it? The department kept the file open. They had to, but with no suspect and no definitive manner of death, the investigation slowed. Tips came in, some wild, some cruel, some genuine. Psychics called the station. Internet strangers demanded footage. Locals whispered about the gap the way small towns whisper about places that feel wrong. And every time someone drove past that section of road at night, hazard lights blinking on their own car, they remembered Marissa's sedan left running like a heartbeat with nobody inside. They remembered the footprints that ended too cleanly. They remembered that audio recording, footsteps circling in the dark, patient and close. And the question became less about how she died and more about what else was out there with her. Because if it happened once, why did it feel like it could happen again? Why did it feel like it could happen again? That question lingered in Gap long after the creek settled back into its normal flow and the search tape was rolled up and thrown away. In small towns, tragedy doesn't vanish when the news cycle ends. It lives in grocery store aisles, in hushed conversations outside church, in the way people lock their doors quicker at night without admitting why. Marissa Lyle's name became something people spoke softly, as if the woods might hear it. And for investigators, the case stayed open in a technical sense, but it also stayed open in their heads, because even the ones who believed there had to be a human explanation couldn't ignore how the evidence behaved. Almost like it was designed to stop just short of certainty, to keep the truth always one step deeper into the dark. 2 weeks after the funeral, the detective assigned to the file requested a second review from state police, hoping fresh eyes would find what the local team couldn't. They re-examined the dashcam footage, this time with an audio specialist who worked traffic collisions and officer-involved incidents. He treated the sound like a puzzle, stripping frequencies and isolating motion patterns. He confirmed what everyone already feared. There was an additional set of footsteps in the recording that could not be attributed to the deputies' movement, and the cadence didn't match animals. The steps were too evenly spaced, too consistent, the weight distribution sounding like bipedal movement, but the specialist wouldn't say human. He couldn't. He said unidentified, a word that felt clean enough to write down, but not clean enough to make the fear go away. Because unidentified wasn't a resolution. It was a door left half open. The department tried to treat it as a homicide until proven otherwise. They compiled a list of anyone with a history of violence in the area, anyone recently released, anyone connected to Marissa's workplace. They pulled traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, hoping to spot her sedan earlier that night, hoping to catch another vehicle following her. Nothing clear surfaced. They canvassed again for witnesses, knocking on doors, asking if anyone heard screams, saw headlights, noticed movement. Most people had been asleep. Some admitted they'd heard something, voices maybe, a car door slam, footsteps on wet ground. But nobody could provide an account strong enough to build a case. It was like the night itself had swallowed sound the way the creek swallowed her, leaving only fragments behind for people to argue over. Then came the witness interview that refused to leave the detective's mind. A man living about 2 miles from the Gap called after seeing Marissa's case mentioned on television. He said he hadn't wanted to get involved because he didn't want attention, didn't want police on his property, didn't want the town looking at him like he was part of it. But guilt had started chewing at him. He told detectives that around 1:50 a.m. on the night Marissa disappeared, he was outside on his porch smoking. He heard footsteps in the distance, slow, wet, leaf-crunching steps. But the road near his home was asphalt, and the trees there didn't drop leaves thick enough to make that sound. He looked toward the dark and saw what he thought was a woman moving along the edge of the tree line, arms held close to her body like she was cold or frightened. And behind her, he said, there was another figure that didn't move the way a person should. It didn't stride confidently. It didn't run. It seemed to drift in small increments, pausing whenever she paused, like it was imitating motion without truly understanding it. The man admitted that was when he went back inside and locked his door, because in that moment he didn't feel like a witness. He felt like prey. The detective documented the statement, asked follow-up questions, requested a sketch, but the man couldn't describe a face. He couldn't describe clothing. He only repeated the same phrases. It didn't move right, and it felt like it knew I was watching. The detective wanted to dismiss it as fear and darkness. He wanted it to be a misinterpretation, because anything else would mean accepting that something unknown was present in the last minutes of Marissa's life. But the witness's description matched too closely with the patterns already seen. Footsteps that stopped when attention turned toward them. Movement that stayed just outside clear light. A presence close enough to follow without ever revealing itself. One investigator later said it felt less like a person hiding, and more like a thing that didn't want to be seen, not because it feared capture, but because being unseen was part of what it was. As winter settled in, reports began trickling into the sheriff's office. Small, strange complaints that normally wouldn't reach law enforcement at all. A couple walking their dog near the Gap claimed they heard footsteps behind them on an empty trail, steady and close, but when they turned there was nobody. A teenager driving home late swore he saw someone standing at the same roadside pull-off where Marissa's car was found, a pale outline barely lit by his headlights, and when he blinked it was gone. A delivery driver taking a shortcut through that road at night reported that his truck cab camera recorded faint tapping and crunching noises on the outside, like something walking alongside him in the trees, keeping pace until he reached open farmland again. None of these reports were strong enough to open a new case. But together, they formed a pattern that made the Gap feel less like the location of a single tragedy, and more like a place where something repeated itself quietly, waiting for the right conditions. The sheriff's office did what offices often do when faced with reports they can't classify. They archived them, filed them under suspicious circumstances without follow-up. But the public didn't archive anything. Locals began calling it Footsteps a Gap, as if naming it could contain it. People warned their kids not to park there at night. Hunters avoided the creek's sink. Couples stopped taking evening walks near the tree line, and yet a few curious people did the opposite. They went looking. They drove out with flashlights and cameras, trying to capture proof, trying to force the woods to confess. Most found nothing. Some heard things they couldn't explain and never went back. And one of them left behind a piece of evidence that made detectives reopen the file, if only briefly, because sometimes the dead aren't the only ones who leave recordings. A young man posted a short clip online taken just after midnight near the Gap, a shaky video of darkness and trees lit by a phone flashlight. The footage looked like 1,000 other amateur haunted woods recordings, heavy breathing, nervous laughter, a friend whispering behind the camera. But the audio was different. You could hear the boy's steps in the leaves, then another set of steps behind him, slightly delayed, matching his pace too perfectly to be coincidence. At one point he stopped walking, holding his breath. The second set of steps stopped too, almost instantly, like it had been trained. He whispered, "Do you hear that?" And the camera tilted toward the darkness, nothing visible, only sound. And then in the final seconds you hear something that made people replay it again and again. A soft exhale, close to the microphone, not his, followed by a single slow step forward, as if whatever was behind him had leaned in to make sure he knew it was there. The video spread fast. The sheriff's office dismissed it publicly, calling it unverified internet footage, but privately they requested the original file. Metadata confirmed it was recorded on that road within a mile of the original scene. It didn't prove murder. It didn't prove anything supernatural. But it proved the sound pattern could happen again, and it proved that multiple people were now reporting the same unnerving behavior. Footsteps that reacted to attention, that stayed close without appearing, that moved like something testing the boundary between seen and unseen. Investigators listened to the clip in the same silent room where they'd listened to Marissa's phone recording months earlier, and the mood was the same: quiet dread, the sense that they were hearing something they didn't have language for. In early January, the detective assigned to the case visited Marissa's sister again, not to deliver news, but because he couldn't shake the unplugged porch camera detail. He asked if Marissa had ever mentioned anyone coming near her home. The sister hesitated, then opened a notebook she'd been keeping since the disappearance, pages filled with dates and memories written like prayers. She pointed to an entry from a week before Marissa died. Marissa had called her late at night crying, whispering, saying she heard footsteps on her porch again. The sister had urged her to call police. Marissa refused. She said, "It stops when I look." Then she said something even more chilling. "It feels like it's waiting for me to stop looking." The detective read those words twice because they didn't sound like paranoia. They sounded like someone describing a pattern. Like someone describing a presence that learned behavior, adapted, and waited patiently for the moment when attention drifted and the target became vulnerable. There was no way to prove any of it. The porch camera footage was gone because it had never been recorded. The outlet plug was wiped. The gap offered no fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon, no clear suspect. Even the footprints had stopped short of giving investigators a second set they could match to a shoe size. And yet the case refused to die quietly, because the evidence, the sound, and the repeated witness claims all pointed toward the same unsettling idea. Marissa might not have been alone that night. Something followed her from the moment she stepped out of her car, stayed close enough to be heard on her phone, and remained close enough to circle police in the woods. If it was human, it was careful and experienced. If it was, then what exactly had been walking beside her, unseen, step for step, until the creak finally took her voice away? By the time spring returned, the town looked normal again from a distance. The road was just a road. The trees were just trees, but people who lived there knew better. They knew there was a spot outside Gap where the air felt colder, where the darkness seemed to press down harder, where even animals hesitated. And if you drove past the pull-off late at night, you might see nothing. But you might also feel it, that quiet sensation of being watched from the tree line, that instinct to speed up without knowing why. Because once you've heard about footsteps that stop when you look, you start wondering what happens when you finally stop looking for good. What happens when you finally stop looking for good? That question became the most terrifying part of the entire case because it wasn't just about Marissa anymore. It was about the idea that something could exist on the edge of attention, quiet, patient, responsive, something that didn't need to sprint or attack openly because it knew people eventually get tired. They blink, they look away, they go home, and then the dark belongs to whatever stayed behind. In the months after Marissa's death, detectives noticed how quickly the town tried to return to normal, how the world demanded closure even when none was available. But the file on Marissa Lyle didn't close. It thickened. Every report of footsteps near the Gap was added to the binder, every caller logged, every shaky voice heard over the phone noted with time and date. It started to look less like a single tragedy, and more like an ongoing pattern that didn't care how many officers investigated it. The sheriff's office brought in a behavioral analyst from a nearby jurisdiction, not officially, not as a headline-worthy consultation, but as a quiet attempt to understand the human side of what might have happened. The analyst reviewed Marissa's habits, the timeline, the physical evidence, the audio. His conclusion was cautious. If a human offender was responsible, they likely knew the area and understood how to control fear without using obvious force. He pointed out the unplugged porch camera as the most criminal element in the case, because it suggested premeditation and surveillance. It meant someone had been close enough to Marissa's home to interfere with her sense of safety, and careful enough to do it cleanly. But then he listened to the dashcam footsteps and paused, eyebrows tightening, because control was one thing, yet these footsteps didn't sound like someone running, hiding, or panicking. They sounded like someone pacing. Like someone who wanted to be heard but not seen. The analyst didn't say supernatural. He didn't say ghost. He only said one word that felt strangely worse: conditioning. As if Marissa had been trained over time to fear the sound of steps more than the sight of a person. That theory pushed detectives back into Marissa's earlier life, looking for a prelude. They interviewed neighbors again, this time not about the night she vanished, but about the weeks before. Several people remembered small details they hadn't thought mattered at first. One neighbor said Marissa started leaving her porch light on all night. Another said she stopped sitting outside in the evenings like she used to, always rushing indoors as soon as she parked. A man who lived across the street mentioned hearing her front door lock click twice, sometimes 3 times, like she couldn't trust herself to stop. When asked if he ever saw anyone suspicious around her duplex, he hesitated and said no. But he admitted there were nights he heard footsteps on her porch, 2 slow, pacing steps, then silence. He assumed it was raccoons until he realized the steps always came at the same time, always around 1:00 a.m., always steady and measured like someone wearing shoes. And the most unsettling part was his final observation. It stopped when the light came on, like whatever it was understood when it was being watched. Investigators checked 911 call history from her address. There were none. That matched what her sister said. Marissa didn't want to call police about something she couldn't prove, but fear doesn't require proof. Fear just requires repetition. One detective noted in his personal notebook that Marissa's last week of life looked like escalation. The porch camera disabled, the footsteps outside, then a sudden night drive that ended with her car abandoned at the gap. It felt like a sequence, like the final act of something that had been building quietly behind the scenes. But if that's true, then the gap wasn't the beginning of the horror. It was simply where it finally became visible. The department requested phone location history in more depth, pulling data to see whether Marissa had been near the gap before. The results were strangely normal. She hadn't been there late at night. She hadn't made a habit of stopping on that road. Her routes were predictable: home, diner, grocery store, sister's place. But one location ping from 2 nights prior caught attention. A brief stop near an old overlooked pull-off not far from the gap, lasting under 2 minutes. Not enough to be meaningful in most cases, but in this one, every minute mattered. It suggested she may have pulled over briefly, maybe to check something, maybe because she felt followed. It also meant the Gap Road wasn't entirely new to her that week. She had been near it before, and that raised the possibility that the road wasn't random, that she might have been drawn there. A forensic tech re-examined Marissa's car and found something that didn't make headlines but changed the mood of the case. On the rear passenger door handle, they found a faint smear consistent with someone touching it and then wiping it, leaving almost nothing behind. Too thin for a clear print, too deliberate to be accidental. It suggested someone might have accessed the vehicle, not from the driver's side where her own prints would be expected, but from behind, like someone approaching from the shadows. Again, it wasn't proof. It wouldn't stand alone in court, but it was another sign of careful contact, another hint of someone who wanted access without leaving a signature. The detective stared at the photo of that smear for a long time, thinking about the audio of footsteps, thinking about the way they seemed to move like a shadow, and he wondered how many crimes get away with themselves simply by staying too quiet to be seen. Then there was the creek sink itself. A week after the recovery, a team returned to search the area for anything missed, anything discarded or hidden. They found nothing. But one deputy noticed a strange detail carved into a tree about 20 yards from where the phone was found. It wasn't fresh graffiti. It was old, weathered, barely visible beneath layers of bark growth. A simple mark, 2 parallel lines and a small curve beneath them, like a symbol someone had repeated over time. Nobody knew what it meant. It could have been a hunter's mark. It could have been meaningless. But the deputy photographed it anyway because in a case like this, even meaningless things feel like clues. And when the photo was shown to an older resident during a community tip meeting, the man's face changed. He said he'd seen that mark before, years ago, when he was a teenager. He said the older kids used to warn them about the gap, told them not to go in there at night because something walks behind you. The man laughed nervously when he said it, like he didn't believe his own memory, but his voice trembled at the end. Because warnings don't survive decades unless they're fed by something real. That comment opened a new folder in the case file, local history. Detectives began looking into older incidents near the gap, crashes, missing pets, strange reports filed and forgotten. They found a few scattered entries going back years. A hiker who claimed he got lost in daylight because the trail felt wrong. A couple who reported hearing footsteps outside their tent but no one was there. A drunk driving arrest where the driver insisted he wasn't running from police. He was running from the sound behind him. Most of those reports had been dismissed as intoxication, nerves, misinterpretation. But stacked together, they formed a faint outline of something persistent. Not a haunting story with glowing eyes and dramatic screams. Something quieter, something behavioral, a place where people repeatedly felt followed. Still, none of that explained Marissa's death. The only way to solve the case was to prove a human offender. Investigators continued checking leads, registered offenders, violent histories, strange vehicles reported in the area. One tip named a local man who often parked near the gap late at night. Deputies interviewed him and found nothing actionable. Another tip claimed a transient camp existed deeper in the woods. Search teams found old fire pits and trash, but no signs of current habitation. The case remained trapped between theories, the most frustrating kind of case, because it gives you just enough to keep chasing and never enough to catch. What haunted the detectives most wasn't the lack of evidence. It was the behavior of the unseen presence described across different accounts. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't rush. It didn't burst out screaming. It followed. It mirrored. It stayed close. It stopped when people turned and looked, like it understood the power of attention. And the longer the case stayed unsolved, the more it felt like that was the point. Like whatever happened to Marissa wasn't meant to be proven cleanly. It was meant to remain a question. A quiet fear that spread from one person to another like cold air seeping under a door. Because if Marissa's last recording captured footsteps behind her, and those same kinds of footsteps kept showing up months later, then how could anyone be sure the thing that followed her ever left? How could anyone be sure the thing that followed her ever left? That was the final shape of the fear in Gap, Pennsylvania. Not a monster with a face, not a ghost in a white dress, not something you could point to and name. It was the idea of a presence that stayed just outside certainty, just outside the reach of flashlights and evidence bags, close enough to be heard but never close enough to be caught. The investigators had done what they were trained to do. They mapped the terrain, collected what little physical evidence existed, reviewed footage, interviewed witnesses, rebuilt timelines until the numbers blurred. But the deeper they went, the more they ran into the same wall. The case refused to become one single thing. It would not settle into homicide. It would not settle into accident. It hovered in that terrible middle ground where reality becomes thin, where even professionals start to speak softer without realizing it. In the second year after Marissa's death, the file was reassigned twice. Not because anyone gave up, but because time wears people down. New detectives would open the binder and feel the same chill the first team felt, not from the photographs themselves, but from the way the story moved. A running car in the dark, a door left open, footprints that ended too cleanly, a phone recording of someone approaching in slow, deliberate steps, dashcam audio capturing movement that mirrored law enforcement in the woods. A body found in water too shallow to easily claim a life. The new investigators would circle the same questions and land in the same silence, because none of it behaved the way evidence is supposed to behave. Evidence is supposed to clarify. This evidence only deepened the shadows. Marissa's family kept pushing for answers. They petitioned for the case to be formally treated as suspicious, not undetermined. They asked for federal assistance, for advanced forensic review, for any outside agency willing to look at it with fresh eyes. They were told there was not enough to justify escalation. No suspect, no confirmed foul play, no confession, no obvious crime scene beyond the abandoned car. Those words sounded practical to officials. To the family, they sounded like another kind of loss, like Marissa was being taken twice, once by whatever happened in the woods, and again by a system that couldn't name the threat. Her sister began speaking publicly, giving interviews, asking anyone who'd driven that road to come forward if they saw anything. She said she didn't want theories. She wanted facts. But in her eyes, you could see the exhaustion of someone trying to force truth out of a place that seemed built to hide it. Then, in a way that felt almost cruel, another incident occurred near the Gap. Not a disappearance, not a death, but something that echoed too closely to ignore. A college student driving home late reported his car stalled near the same pull-off. He called roadside assistance, then waited in his vehicle with the doors locked. He later told police that while he sat there, he heard footsteps outside, slow and wet, crunching like leaves even though he could see bare gravel through his windshield. The footsteps circled the car once, then stopped directly beside his driver's door. He said he didn't look. He couldn't, because something in him knew that if he looked, it would stop, and if it stopped, he would never know where it went. The student stayed frozen, breathing shallow, and after nearly a full minute, the footsteps moved away again, slow and patient, disappearing into the trees as calmly as they had arrived. He waited another 10 minutes before daring to move, and when the tow truck finally arrived, he told the driver he wanted to leave immediately. No questions, no inspection, no curiosity. Just gone. When police asked why he didn't exit the vehicle, he answered with a simple sentence that matched Marissa's sister's notebook entry in a way that made the detective's stomach turn. It felt like it was waiting for me to stop paying attention. The report went into the same archive as the others, unconfirmed. No visual contact, no evidence of a crime, but for the people who read it, the pattern tightened. It wasn't just a story people told after Marissa died. Something was still happening there in small, deniable moments, just enough to remind everyone the Gap hadn't finished with them. Officers driving that route at night began choosing different roads when they could. Locals stopped pulling over there for phone calls. Teenagers stopped daring each other to walk the trail after dark, not because they believed in ghosts, but because it only takes one true story to make fear feel practical. And Marissa's case, with its documented contradictions and lingering recordings, had become exactly that kind of story. The last official review of the evidence didn't produce a breakthrough, but it produced a statement that felt like the closest thing to honesty the system could allow. In an internal note, a detective wrote that the case contained multiple unexplained auditory anomalies and witness accounts of perceived pursuit. And while the note offered no conclusion, it recommended continued monitoring of reports near the gap in case a pattern developed that could point to a human offender. It was careful language. Professional language, but between the words was something raw, the acknowledgement that something out there behaved like a pursuer, even if nobody could prove it wore a human face. And that left the case hanging where it began, at the edge of the woods, where a woman's footprints ended without explanation. If the truth is purely human, then someone out there got away with an almost perfect crime, using darkness and geography like tools, leaving behind only enough trace to keep investigators chasing fog. And if the truth isn't purely human, then Marissa wasn't hunted by a weapon, but by a presence, something that moved when she moved, stopped when she stopped, followed when she tried to get away, and stayed silent enough to remain a question instead of a conviction. Either way, the ending is the same. Marissa never came back down that trail. The gap kept what happened next, and the people left behind were forced to live with the worst kind of uncertainty, the kind you can't arrest, can't bury, can't close with a final report. Sometimes late at night, when the wind is right and the leaves are wet, drivers still swear they hear it when they pass that stretch of road. Not a voice, not a scream, just slow footsteps somewhere beyond the headlights, keeping pace in the darkness like a shadow with weight. Maybe it's nothing, maybe it's an animal, maybe it's nerves, or maybe it's the echo of something that learned long ago that the easiest way to stay powerful is to stay unseen. Because if it never shows its face, it never has to be explained. And that's what makes Footsteps at Gap such a hard story to put away. Not because it proves the paranormal, not because it promises a killer hiding behind every tree, but because it shows how thin the line can be between a crime scene and a haunting, between evidence and silence, between what we know and what we feel in our bones when the dark gets too quiet. Marissa Lyle's name deserves more than a checkbox that reads undetermined. It deserves an answer. But until that answer arrives, the gap remains what it has always been. A narrow cut in the woods where footsteps are heard, lives are changed, and the truth stays just out of reach, waiting. So I'll leave you with this. If your car died on that road late at night, and you heard slow footsteps circling you in the dark, footsteps that stopped the moment you looked, would you step out and try to see what it was, or would you stay locked inside, holding your breath, praying it passes you by? If you want more real cases where true crime and the unexplained collide, follow same scary stories, because some mysteries don't end when the search does. They just learn how to stay hidden.